Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name is Crystal. I post videos a few times a week. I focus mostly on fantasy books and romance, and I have a particular interest in romantasy and historical romance, so welcome. So today's video is a fun one. This is something that I've been wanting to do for a while, and I kind of had a hard time putting this list together, because I feel like if you Google like top 10 best fantasy worlds, you get a lot of classic fantasies that are typically dominated by male authors. But my personal favorite when it comes to fantasy worlds are worlds that are immersive and that have really beautiful details, and they don't necessarily need to be in a high fantasy setting, which means like they don't have to be exclusively their own world. Some of my favorite fantasy worlds are kind of like an urban setting type of vibe where it feels close to our world, but it has some magical elements that are different and that make this world feel like, man, I really wish that's how our real world actually was. So let's go ahead and get into it. These are my top 10 favorite fantasy worlds. So the first one that I want to mention is the big dog, the biggest one, and it is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. Now, Brandon Sanderson is known for his incredible world building. He is able to create worlds in his fantasy books unlike anything that I have ever read before. I have read and loved many of Brandon's books and his fantasy worlds, but my favorite by far is the Stormlight Archive, and that is mostly because of what a unique and immersive place this is, and also how broad and vast it is in scope. So in this world we have a lot of different elements of magical beings that are not really easy to describe. There are some magic in here that is powered by storms, there are some that is some sort of like almighty type of being that then rules the power, and there are these little tiny creatures called spren that are sort of like emotions, or how humans would perceive emotions, and they are to be found in different types all throughout this world whenever strong emotions are felt. So you have like hate spren, angry spren, and they are these kind of very whimsical beings, but they don't typically interact with humans a whole lot, except for sometimes they do. This world also has some really great fantasy creatures, some really big, beautiful fantasy war horses, some creatures that seem kind of terrifying, that seem to resemble insects, and just the whole thing I love about this world specifically is how it feels like anything is possible in here. Anything is possible in here, but at the same time it has rules that make you understand and realize that, yes, potentially anything could be possible, but also that doesn't mean that it's a get out of jail free card anytime our characters get in trouble. A lot of times it is the fantasy world itself that causes problems in the lives of our characters. So this is one of the deepest and richest and most imaginative fantasy worlds that I've ever read, and it deserves top spot on here for number one. So Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson is my number one fantasy world that I love and adore so much. Okay, now this next one is one that I was talking about that feels like this is not a high fantasy world. This feels like it is a world that is very similar to ours. It feels close to what we would have as an urban setting, and it is Jade City, the Greenbone Saga. This is one of my favorite fantasy worlds because it taps into things that I personally really, really love in a way that feels like these characters have the potential to have superpowers, which I just love and adore. I am a huge superhero nerd. I loved X-Men, Batman growing up. I love it. So this whole world is similar to an Asian country that feels very similar to our world. So it's Asian-based fantasy and something that feels realistic. So there are cars, there are restaurants, there are modern day things in here, but the whole world is made up, it's fantasy, and the thing that powers and drives it is the power of Jade. Jade is something that gives these characters, some of them, not all of them. There are characters in this world that are not affected by the magical powers of Jade, but Jade is something that changes these characters and gives them enhanced abilities, whether that's through fighting, through battle, through how they deal with other people. Jade in here powers everything that they do and gives them heightened powers, sensitivities, and superpowers essentially. And it's also a mark of their rank and status. The more Jade that you have, the more powerful that you are. And everybody, typically a lot of people, are scrambling to have the most Jade. So I think that is just such a fascinating concept, and I really, really love this whole fantasy world. And yeah, this is on my favorite fantasy worlds for a reason. It's very immersive while also being very easy to understand and feel like it's relatable. It doesn't feel like it's too far off base. Like, this feels like this could happen, Okay, so now this next one is actually a standalone book in a series, and the world is The Crowns of Nyaxia. The book I want to talk about specifically is Slaying the Vampire Conqueror by Carissa Broadbent. Carissa Broadbent writes romantasy, but the way that she builds and develops her fantasy worlds is so completely compelling and stunning that I feel like she is a top-tier fantasy author as well. And that's really why she is my favorite romantasy author, is because she gives you great romances, great characters, great romantic development, while at the same time her world building is rock solid and so unique and interesting while still having elements that are similar that make it easy to get into. So this whole world in Slaying the Vampire Conqueror, this is a standalone in her, series, The Crowns of Nyaxia. We have vampires, but we also have, in this book specifically, we have our heroine is an acolyte of this goddess cult, basically. So she has her own powers and her own abilities, and part of that is because, she's masked off all of her senses, like her eyes, her vision, and she relies on her other senses to see and feel her way through the world. I really like the whole setup in this world of the gods and the goddesses and how that impacts the people. I like learning about the vampires and how they exist in this world and how they interact with other people. I just feel like this is such a solid and interesting world for vampires and other fantasy creatures that are similar, and I love seeing how our plot is moving forward because of the fantasy world that she's created. So this one is one of my favorite fantasy worlds from a favorite author for sure. Okay, so now this next one is a fantasy world that is very ethereal and very beautiful, but also just like so compelling at the same time, and also can be quite dark, and that is Daughter of Smoke and Bone by Laini Taylor. So Laini Taylor is masterful at creating worlds that feel so real while at the same time feeling a little bit bizarre, if that makes any sense at all. Every single one of her books that I've read, I was going to put Strange the Dreamer on this list too, because I also love that fantasy world, and that one feels very ethereal and almost a little bit like mystical and how that world is put together. But I decided to go with Daughter of Smoke and Bone simply because I feel like the differences in the human world and the fantasy world in here is very stark, and even within the fantasy world, the differences between like the good fantasy and the evil fantasy, it's very stark as well. And I think there are a lot of interesting delineations of what is good and what is evil and how that may overlap in both of those worlds. Even though it's something that I think is interesting because we have angels and we have devils in this world, essentially what we would call them as humans. But the devils aren't necessarily the bad people. They may be animals, beasts with different body parts. They're chimera. Some of them have horns, some of them have tails, fangs, claws, but they are not beasts and they are not evil. Whereas the angels, the seraphim in this world, they typically are the ones who are evil and conniving and are doing machinations to bring about ruin and war. So I feel like this fantasy world is so compelling and interesting, and the fact that it is blended with our human world, where we have human characters in here, it does really feel like, what if there was a door that we could just go into and see this whole vast fantasy world that existed. So Daughter of Smoke and Bone is one of my favorite fantasy worlds of all time. I think it is so beautifully well put together and so gorgeously executed. I just adore it in every freaking way. Okay, so now this next world is one that is also a little bit on the lighter side because this is based solidly in the real world with fantasy elements coming into play as well, and that is The Bear and the Nightingale, the Winter Night series by Katherine Arden. This is such a beautiful book. This is such a beautiful series, and one of the things that makes it so beautiful is the way that the fantasy world is constructed and how it blends with the natural world, how it feels very ethereal while at the same time feeling very dangerous and very stark and very deadly, even though at the same time it's beautiful. And those are always the fantasy worlds that really get me the most, the ones that feel like this is so compelling and so beautiful, but if you take a step wrong or if you trust the wrong person, you're a goner, or your people are a goner, So this has the advantage of a natural setting set in winter in Russia, while we still have this fantasy world that is right there, but not everybody can see it. You have to have the sight to be able to see the fantasy world. But when you can see it, we have all of these different creatures and different gods and different powers, and it's just beautiful and compelling, and I love it. I love this world so much, even if at times it feels scary and kind of tragic. Okay, so now this next one is another one that has similar vibes in a way to The Bear and the Nightingale, and it is Wolfskin by Juliette Marilier. So this is a series that is based in historical time setting. So this is kind of a Norwegian and Nordic type of historical fantasy, while at the same time it has elements of a fantasy world where we would think of them maybe as like the Fae or the others. There's something about this world, this book, that is mystical, that is otherworldly, but it's not fully described, and there are passages of this book that feel like it's just reading like historical fiction as they're going about their journey. You know, we have Vikings are a concept in here. We have our hero who wants to be a Wolfskin. He wants to be a warrior. He wants to be a warrior for Thor, essentially. And he wants all of that power, and he believes that there is power in this Wolfskin. And he is also aware that there is a dark and deadly power in people that he knows that is something that he shouldn't really want to touch or try to be a part of. And the beautiful magical element of this comes in our heroine, who has a deep connection with the natural world and the gods and goddesses there that sort of power her and fuel her and give her promptings to know what to do and how to help people when great evil is sensed. So this one feels like a very intuitive fantasy world, and I just ate it up, and I thought it was just so compelling, and I kind of wanted to just live here for days. Okay, now this one is a recent one, and it is one of my favorite fantasy worlds, and it is When the Moon Hatched by Sarah A. Parker. So I read this book early on when it was brand new, first released, and I immediately fell in love with it. I loved the world in this book. I think that it is so unique among romantasy, and I love the whole concept of having dragons that are bonded with humans, and when they die or when they perish, they then go up into the sky as moons, and they sort of stay up there. I love the whole concept of dragons feeling very sacred in this book, and even though there isn't like a ton of magic, there's this whole concept of dragons being so prominent in this world and so important to the plot and so important to the individual people who are, you know, riders and bonded with them. I really loved the whole concept of magic in this book and how sometimes it can be very subtle and sometimes it can be very strong depending on their own ability to tap into it. I love this fantasy world, and I think that maybe one of the reasons I love it so much is because I read the glossary in the beginning before I read the book and was just like eating up all of the facts, all of the creatures, everything about this world. I was like, yes, this is exactly my type of fantasy. I love getting in information like that and learning about a history of the world. I thought it was great. I loved it. Okay, so now these next three I'm going to pair as one because these are ones that are very, very popular. And they are a little bit old, but they are some of my favorite fantasy worlds to escape to, and I just feel like they are so well developed and are so fun. So the first one in this group of three is the Shadowhunter world. I love Cassandra Clare. I think she has created such a fun world that is pure urban fantasy that feels like, okay, this is actually a section of the world that exists. All we have to do is just be able to find a way to see it. Like, I just love that concept so much. It's one of my favorites in fantasy. I love the whole idea that women are just as strong warriors of men in this world. I love that they are gifted with powers and that they have runes they can put on their body and how that, you know, the partnership with somebody else marking you. I love everything about that. I love the whole concept overall of fighting against evil and fighting demons and the Shadowhunters being sort of blessed with an angelic power. Like, I just find that really, really fascinating. I think that every time there's a villain introduced in this world, it's fascinating to see how they're created and how they come about and what they're actually trying to do in this fantasy world. I think it's fabulous. I love this whole world so much. Another one in this series of three is The Raven Boys by Maggie Stiefvater. So this is a one that has a very light sense of world building. It almost feels a bit like magical realism because it is so mystical and not really clearly defined, and it relies again on the natural world. In The Raven Boys, we have a group of teenagers, a girl and some boys, and there are some magical elements that some of them have. Some of them can take things out of dreams, some of them are psychic and can see the future, and some of them can just amplify the powers of others. And a lot of that is based locationally where they're at, where there are ley lines from the past and kings and magic. And it's just fascinating, and I love the way that the magic of this world permeates deep into the characters, and you can't separate that character from the magic or from the world, the fantasy world that they live in. So Another one of these that I will always love a fantasy world is the Grishaverse. So we're talking about Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows, but I would say very specifically probably Six of Crows. Well, that's not entirely true. It's just the whole fantasy world in here. We get to see different locations of it because the setting in Six of Crows is a different area than the setting in Shadow and Bone. But I love the whole concept of these characters having magical powers and being sort of divided into groups depending on what their powers are. I love that some of them can have powers that, you know, take care of the weather. Some are people who have powers over hearts and bodies. Some are people who have power over like accuracy and guns and weaponry. I just think that it's very clever how she set up the fantasy world to give all of these people powers, whereas nobody has every single power in this world. But some people have stronger powers than others, and it's just fascinating. I love this world so much. Okay, now another fantasy world that has been one of my favorites for a very long time is A Darker Shade of Magic by VE Schwab. I love this world so much. I love the whole concept of a portal fantasy and the way that he's able to, Kel, the main hero, is able to travel through worlds, that there are 3 different Londons essentially, White London, Red London, Black London, and how he's the only one who can go between them essentially, and why he does that, and how one world is so different from the other. And I just love the whole idea of his coat being the key to this, and the whole idea that there is this world that is very similar to ours, but only some people can access to it, and how are things going to be different over there than how they are here. It's fabulous. I love this world. And I also will say that I think that she really expanded and built this world even further in the spin-off, or the next book, The Fragile Swords of Power. I really loved seeing what she did with the world in that book as well. Okay, and then the last book that I want to talk about is another recent one, and this one isn't released until September 24th of 2024, so if you're watching this before then, this hasn't come out yet, but it is The Wraith King by Juliet Cross. So Juliet Cross is an author who writes a lot of romance. She does paranormal romance, she's done some small town romance, but this is her first fantasy romance in a high fantasy setting. So she has created this world entirely on her own, and we have different categories of fae. So we have light fae, we have demon fae, shadow fae, wraith fae, moon fae. We have all of these different types of fae in here, but it feels solidly set in a fantasy world. This isn't the type of fantasy that feels like, oh, this is an urban setting with some fae in it. No, this is a high fantasy setting for the fae in this world. And it feels, again, like this relies largely on the natural world. There are some things about gods and goddesses in here. There are the way that people look differently, like the Wraith Fae. They look much different. They have horns than the Moon Fae, who are more ethereal and more beautiful. And I just feel like this is the type of fantasy world that is very immersive, that is very solidly built and constructed, and has all of the elements in here to create a convincing world that makes you feel like you are in a different reality. And I love that so much. So there you have it. Those are my top 10 favorite, maybe like 13, fantasy worlds right now. I hope y'all enjoyed this video. Please let me know what a favorite fantasy world of yours is below. I would love to check it out, and I will see y'all in my next video.